Hey, what's up everybody? Nathan Kidd here. In this video, I'm going to take you through using the SonEQ 2, the brand new plugin by Sonimus, to mix some vocals in a pop track that I've made. I'll take you through each move that I'm doing with the EQ, why I'm doing it, and what it's doing to the vocals within the mix. Now, something worth noting here is the majority of work that I do as singers is actually done remotely, and this is becoming very common practice within the industry these days. So as a producer, this means that I usually make a track and then send that track to the singer to record, usually within their home studio setting. So most of the tracks that I get back are not necessarily recorded within a professional studio setting with a very well treated room and a really good mic selection. Usually the room is okay and there's only one or two mics to choose from. So that's why I heavily rely on the tools that I have to treat the tracks that I get back from the singers. And having a really good EQ is a big part of that process to make sure that my vocals always sound professional. Okay, so let's just dive right into the session here. I've kept the session pretty clean just to make things easy. I have the stereo of the instrumental here, and then on these bright blue tracks are all my vocal tracks that I'll be showing. So this is the verse vocal here. Then these are a chorus backing vocal that are routed to this stereo track here. And then these are my three chorus lead vocals that are routed to this stereo track here. So I like to route things just to individual tracks so that I have more control over groupings of vocals and that sort of thing. So as far as my chain goes on the vocals, they're kind of the same between like the verse and the chorus vocals. So I'll just kind of go over the verse vocal here. So I like to start with a de-esser typically, just to tame some of the S's right up front. Then I like to go into a corrective EQ. So what I do with this EQ is take away frequencies usually. So I'm taking away frequencies that I might not want necessarily in the vocal, or if there's frequencies that I find that are a little bit too aggressive, I like to tame some of those frequencies before moving on to any other processing. So after that, I go into a couple of compressors. I have a Satson channel strip, a Tuco compressor, and then I'm going into another SonEQ 2 that I use more as additive EQ. And I use it last because I like to use it to shape the vocal within the mix. So I'm not correcting necessarily, I'm more adding EQ to help shape the vocal to make it sit in the mix. And then I just have another de-esser at the end to help with the S's again, and then I have a vocal doubler as an effect. So just going back to this first EQ here, so again, I'm using it as a corrective EQ, meaning I'm taking away frequencies. So the first thing I'm doing is running it through the high pass filter on the preamp section. I'm doing this because there's almost no tone in the really low end in a vocal. Like 100 hertz and lower for sure. It's just going to be muddy. It's going to affect the sound in ways that you don't want. So I'm just getting rid of that. I have this set at about 150 hertz. Now, how you might have this set is very singer dependent. It can change based on how low the person's voice is, right? And this can definitely change depending if they're a female singer or a male singer. Typically, a female singer, you'd set it a little bit higher, male is a little bit lower. In this case, I have a female singer, but her voice isn't super high, so I have it set somewhere in the middle, about 150 hertz. I generally shoot for about 100 to 200 hertz. That's a good range to kind of mess around with. I've gone higher, sometimes 250, 300 even, if I really don't want any low end there and they have a higher voice, things like that. So, but 100 and 200 is a good range to shoot for. So then the low mid band here, I have 500 hertz just dipped a little bit. It can be a little bit muddy in that range. There is a lot of tone there, so I don't want to get rid of too much, but I have just about a 2 dB cut, just really subtle. And then I have the high Q button on, so I'm using a narrow EQ band just to focus in on those specific frequencies. And then on the high mid band, a similar thing, a 2 dB cut at 3K. So the 3K to 5K range can be an aggressive and bitey range, kind of piercing to the ears. So I like to tame a little bit of that before going into any other processing again. And again, I'm using the mid Q, which is a bit of a narrower EQ band, just to specifically hit those frequencies. So now the reason that I like to do corrective EQing before anything else is because I want to get rid of those frequencies that I don't really want in the vocal before I go into my compressors, because I don't want my compressors reacting to the low end in the vocal when I don't want the low end in the vocal there in the first place. So because it can affect how the compressor reacts. So that's why it's good to just do some corrective EQing before going into any other processing. So then going to the EQ that's after my compression, which is my additive EQ. So I'm using this to basically shape the vocal for how I want it to sit in the mix. So again, I do have the high pass set just to make sure after my compression there's still no low end that's going to muddy up my mix in the vocal. And then I have a little bit of a boost, just a subtle boost around 1K. So that's where a lot of the body and the tone of the vocal is. So I found myself just wanting to boost that area with a wide band a little bit there. And then in the high band, I wanted to boost quite a bit at 12K, which there's not a lot of tone at 12K, but that's where the airiness of the vocal is. So 12K and up, 10K and up, that kind of thing. So I'm doing quite a bit of boosting because I find a really good thing about this EQ is that the high shelf is very, very smooth. It's very transparent. It's a great high band. So the last thing I'm doing here is adding some saturation with the drive knobs here. So you've noticed that I've used 2 preamp sections here. And that's a cool thing you can do with the SonEQ 2 is add multiples of these modules, or you can move things around to kind of customize your plugin. So I really liked the circuit that the drive knobs add. They just kind of add some analog saturation and characteristics that you would get by using an analog preamp or an analog mixing console. So I really liked it, so I wanted more of it. And it really just kind of smooths and rounds out the high end specifically in the vocal and adds some interesting characteristics to the body of the vocal that I really liked. So I wanted more of it. I just want to talk about saturation in a little bit more detail here, what it is, what it does to your audio, and why it's so important to use it in your mixes. So saturation originally comes from using analog gear and driving the circuits in that gear hard enough so that it actually lightly distorts and colors the audio. And that's what really gives analog gear that sound. That's why it sounds so good. So when you add saturation or distortion to an audio signal, what it's actually doing is generating some extra harmonic content that is not initially found within your clean signal. And this extra harmonic content can often be very pleasing and add some extra texture and depth to your audio. And it can range from being very aggressive, or it can be very subtle and very soft. So there's a few different types of saturation. There's tape saturation, which is very warm sounding. There's tube amp saturation, which is usually a little bit more aggressive. A guitar amp is a really good example of that. And then there's transistor saturation, which is the type that you would find from using things like analog preamps or an analog mixing console. This is the type of saturation that the drive knob on the SonEQ 2 emulates. This type of saturation is very smooth and very subtle sounding. It does a really good job of taming or rounding out any of the high-end frequencies that could be a little bit too aggressive or bitey in your audio. So this makes it specifically very useful for things like vocals, where you want a very smooth and very textured sounding vocal. So it'll do a good job of taming any high-end frequencies that could be aggressive in a voice, and it'll also add some interesting harmonic character to the vocal as well to really help it sit in the mix. Okay, so I'm going to play the vocal soloed, and I'm going to disable the 2 EQs so you can hear what it sounds like without them first.
I'm filled with wonder, with all I see. When storm meets thunder, and all the powers compete.
Okay, now with the 2 EQs engaged.
I'm filled with wonder, with all I see. When storm meets thunder, and all the powers compete.
So you can just hear how much cleaner and clearer the vocal comes through with those EQs in. Again, getting rid of that low end really helps to clean up the vocal and just get rid of some of the muddiness that's there. And then my high end boost really just adds some clarity. And then I'll show you what the drive knobs do here.
I'm filled with wonder, with all I sea. When storm meets thunder and all the powers compete.
So it's pretty subtle, but it just adds some interesting texture and this kind of thickness to the vocal that's not there without it. So I really like having both those drive knobs in. So now let's hear what that sounds like in the mix here.
I'm filled with wonder, with all I see. When storm meets thunder and all the powers compete. I'm filled with wonder when we meet. Beyond a current pulls me to my knees.
So obviously I have just some extra effects going on as well, like delays and reverbs and all that kind of stuff, but I won't get into that in this video here. But so I'll play that again in the mix without the EQs.
I'm filled with wonder, with all I see. When storm meets thunder and all the powers compete.
So it's not like it sounds bad, but it just kind of lacks that placement in the mix and that clarity. So using those EQs just really helps sit the vocal where I want it and bring that kind of modern sheen to the vocal that I really like. So now moving on to the chorus vocals, they're basically set out the same way. I just separate things a little bit differently. So on the individual tracks, this goes for both the backing vocals and the lead vocals that I have, I basically use the same chain, but I separate the chain a little bit. So I use my my corrective EQ on the individual channels, and then I like to use my additive EQ on the buses, so on the sends. And I like to use one of my compressors on there as well. But the reason I like to treat the vocals as a group a little bit is just to kind of meld the double takes together so they sound like they're gelling together a little bit. And one of the reasons I like to do a little bit of treatment on the individual channels before going to a bus is when I have doubles, I like to have the center vocal the brightest. And so I take the vocals that are panned left and right, and on this EQ, I actually have the low pass filter set just to filter out the highest frequencies of those vocals that are panned left and right. And so what that does is just kind of takes the high end away from the sides and keeps it in the middle so that the attention of the listener is always mostly in the center and geared towards the center vocal. So here's what the chorus vocals sound like with the EQs on.
So let it flow.
Okay, now I'll play the same part with the EQs off.
So let it flow.
So an interesting thing about this track is there's actually some overlapping vocals that happen in the chorus, and a trick that I use to help those vocals blend with each other is I actually automated on the backing vocals the low pass filter so that when those vocals come in, I'm rolling off some of the high end on those backing vocals. So when the lead vocals come in, the lead vocals become the brightest vocal and they capture the attention, and the backing vocals kind of take a step back in the mix. By losing some of that high end, they kind of step back, right? Just a neat little trick to help those vocals so that they don't get in the way of each other when they do overlap. So I'll play the track at that spot, and you can see this low pass filter knob change as those vocals come in. Yeah, to just help them sit back when that lead vocal takes over. It's a neat little trick there. So you can tell the EQs just really help the vocal to sit in the mix, and they take away some of the low end that is muddy and just kind of makes the vocal get a little bit lost in the mix, and it brings them up front a little bit, but not so much that they're piercing or biting, right? That's the really nice part about the smooth high end with the saturation with the SonEQ 2. Hopefully you found some of this content useful and are now able to improve some of your own vocal mixes using Sonimus's new plugin, the SonEQ 2. Till next time.